Hello everyone, it's Dan here, and in this video I'll be talking about the books that I've read in the past year. I've made a video talking about books last year. There'll be a link to that in the description, but I've read a lot more since then. Here I have all of the books that I read since that last video, and I've been really enjoying reading recently. It's a really good time to read right now. Maybe if you guys like this video, we'll have a little book club. But in any case, the first book that I read, which was last year, in fact, most of these I read last year. I went like on a reading spree in the beginning of 2019 when I read about 10 books in like 1.5 months. Now, those 10 books were not that long on average. They're like a bit over 200 pages. But in any case, it was a very good experience. But I kind of got burned out after that. And then I didn't read almost anything for a whole year. And I picked it up in May of this year, and I've read 4 books during this time. So this is Japan, A Short History by Mikiso Hane. This is kind of a book that outlines Japan's history. It was quite useful, I thought, because I wanted to have kind of at least some image of Japanese history from start to end in my head, so that then I can learn more stuff and just kind of fill in the gaps you know, learn things more in detail. And I'm also planning to read another book about Japanese history, which is a bit more detailed. I think it's called A Modern History of Japan by Andrew Gordon, but that'll be for another time. Anyways, this was a good outline of Japanese history. If you would like to learn about Japan's history, I would recommend this book. The next book was The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. This is a very short read. I think I read this in like 3 hours, which is the fastest I've ever read a single book. But you can see just how small this is. It's just a short story about, as you would think, the old man in the sea. And I think it teaches an interesting lesson. I would say that the lesson I took away from it is that even if you're working towards a certain goal, while it is important to persevere and not give up, you can sometimes actually end up worse off just blindly pursuing that goal and not giving up. So I thought it was an interesting read. Now, the next book that I read was Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. And I was told by everyone that I am probably not ready for Nietzsche, and I definitely wasn't. This is a very difficult read. I did not understand the vast majority of this book. This is just kind of a book that I wanted to read now and then kind of revisit it when I'm older and when I can maybe understand it better. But yeah, this is a very difficult book. I can't really recommend it if you're not interested in like philosophy and stuff like that. It's very like metaphorical, very philosophical. But yeah, I was definitely not ready for this book, and there isn't really much I can say about it because I did not understand most of it. The next book I read was The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. This is a pretty easy read. It's a story about a mad scientist who wanted to conquer the world, and he figured out a way to turn himself invisible. But yeah, I guess it's an interesting read. I read it in a day and a half. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorites. Maybe not the best introduction to H.G. Wells. This is the only book from him that I've read so far, but I've heard he's a very talented author, and I would definitely want to read more from him because it seems like he's pretty good with sci-fi stuff and stuff like that. I'm interested in reading War of the Worlds. That is a book that I actually own, but I haven't read yet. I would recommend this book if you just have the time to read something short, but I wouldn't say it's anything spectacular, to be honest. Now, this next book I read was a book about languages, Fluent Forever by Gabriel Wyner. This book does have some pretty good, useful ideas about language learning, but I think it kind of suffers from the same thing that a lot of kind of language gurus, if you want to say, suffer from, which is that many of them think that their method is the best method. They don't really consider that different people learn in different ways. And while there are some good techniques and good ideas in this book, I wouldn't say that this is like the perfect method that everyone learning a foreign language should follow. Definitely far from that. But it is an interesting read nonetheless. If you do end up deciding to pick up this book, I recommend that you go in thinking of it as a source of ideas not as a tutorial for learning a foreign language. Now, these two books I'll only mention briefly because, again, I read them over a year ago and I barely remember the contents of them. This is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I do remember liking this book when I read it, but I still don't remember what exactly happened in this book. It is about a painter who painted a portrait of a very beautiful man, as he described, and he ended up becoming obsessed with this painting and just kind of began to lose his mind. I thought it was an interesting read. I would recommend this book. Now, this is a book that I was very excited to read at the time. It's A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This is a book that many people recommend as like a very good piece about like a dystopian future. It's a sci-fi book. And I would say it is a good book. I definitely cannot argue with that. But I feel like it gets maybe a little too much praise. A lot of people bring it up when they talk about 1984. And that book I loved. That is still one of my favorite books. I've read it even before last year. I think I read it in like 2017. I would definitely recommend that book to anyone who is interested in the dystopian genre. But this book is a good entry in that genre. But I wouldn't say that it is like a masterpiece that people tend to evaluate it as. That being said, it is still a good book and a good piece of science fiction, and I definitely can recommend this. I just wouldn't give it quite as much praise as I've heard some people give it. Now, these are the books that I've read this year. The first one was Tokyo Ueno Station by Miri. This was a book that I got last year when I went to a press conference held by Miri and the translator of this book, where they just talked about this book and the topic of it, and actually got it signed by the author, which was nice. This book talks about the lives of homeless people that live in Ueno Park in Tokyo. It is quite a sad book. It is written from the point of view of Kazu, who is a homeless man who lived in this park. It kind of follows his life and about the difficulties he had, because Japan has kind of a dark history with how it treats its poor, and these homeless people kind of had to move around a lot. For example, every time the Japanese emperor would pass the Ueno Park, they had to leave for that day and then come back later. And another thing is that it talks about the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, specifically about the preparations for those Olympics and how the Japanese government wanted to make the country seem better, and they wanted to clean things up, just make Tokyo a more inviting place, I guess. And part of that was making the homeless people move out, because some of them had like little sheds or tents set up in Ueno Park, which is where they lived. It's kind of a sad book. I would recommend it if you're interested in Japanese society, culture, history, stuff like that. It's definitely opened up my eyes to the lives of the homeless, not just in Japan, but in general. The next book I read, which is actually one of the longest books I've read, is Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. This is my first Murakami book, but it would not be my last. I definitely like this book. This is probably one of my favorite books. Not that I've read that many. I think there are 21 books that I've finished at this point. This book was quite interesting. It talks about Watanabe, who is a student in Tokyo, and describes Watanabe's life in university. So in school, he had a very close friend called Kizuki, and Kizuki had a girlfriend called Naoko. And I can't really go further into detail. It just talks about the lives of Watanabe, Kizuki, Naoko, and later another friend of Watanabe's, who's Midori, a girl that studies in university with him. All I can say without spoiling it is that it is kind of a sad book, maybe even depressing to some people. I personally really like sad stories, so to me this was quite an interesting read. Another thing to note, which you would already know if you've read any of Murakami's books, is that it is quite sexual. Murakami goes very deep into detail about some things, and it is written from the point of view of a guy, so you can maybe imagine how that would look. But I mean, I like my pervy stuff too, so I personally thought this was a good book. If you don't mind that type of sexual stuff, if you don't mind a story that is maybe at times depressing, then I would recommend this book. Now, this is the longest book I've ever read, and maybe my favorite. I'm still not sure. I've read this very recently, so my opinion could change over time, but right now this is the book that I think about the most. It is Dune by Frank Herbert. This is the first part of a sci-fi novel series. It tells the story of the family of Atreides, which are a royal family who live on the planet called Caladan, which is a planet that has a lot of greenery, has a lot of water, like a very kind of tropical planet, I guess. And due to some politics, they end up moving to another planet called Arrakis, which is kind of like Tatooine from Star Wars. It is basically a desert planet, and their family has to somehow manage to turn that planet kind of around to make it more habitable for people. It isn't much of an action book. It's kind of more philosophical, talks about the politics of the different royal families that live in this world. I definitely recommend this book. It is quite long and it has 5 more parts, so it would be quite a lot to get into, but I've heard some people say that they read just this book alone and it worked fine on its own. I personally wouldn't say so. I'm definitely looking forward to reading the rest of the series. And yeah, I can definitely recommend this. Now, the last book that I've finished is Hear the Wind Sing by Haruki Murakami. This is actually the first book that Murakami has ever written, and I would say it really shows. This was quite a short book and quite a boring book. It is the first part of a 4-part series. This is actually a bundle that has the first 2 parts of that series. I've only read the first one so far, and I can't really say much about it. It is about a guy who studies in university, and he has a couple friends in this small city, which is his hometown, and he's visiting for the summer holidays, I think, and he meets this interesting girl. Yeah, I guess it's just kind of about their relationship and his relationship with his friends. Not a lot that happens. I can't really say if I recommend this because I've not read the other parts, so I don't know if it's worth getting into it. Now, this is a book that I am reading right now. This is my second book by Friedrich Nietzsche, which is Beyond Good and Evil. This is also a philosophical book, of course. Friedrich Nietzsche is a well-known German philosopher from the 19th century. And so far, I can't understand this book either. I've read the first chapter. There are 9 chapters in total. And this is kind of a continuation of Nietzsche's ideas about philosophy from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. There isn't much I can say about it. Again, if you're not really ready for something like this, I can't recommend it. It is quite difficult to digest, and I don't know if I'll take away anything from it. It mentions free will in the first chapter, which was something I found interesting. It also talks a lot about other philosophers and their ideas. There wasn't a lot that I understood from the first chapter, but it's a short read, so I figured might as well give it a shot. And yeah, that's about everything that I read this past year. I'm planning to read the second part of Murakami's series, which is called Pinball 1973. This series was actually recommended to me by a friend, a Japanese friend of mine. So yeah, hopefully it'll be interesting. I'm interested enough to where I thought I would read the rest of the series. There are 2 more books after this, which are Wild Sheep Chase, I think, and then Dance, Dance, Dance is the final book. There are quite a few other books that I'm planning to read. There is Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, a Russian author. I'm also definitely planning to read Dune Messiah, which is a sequel to Dune, and then the rest of Murakami's series. So I don't know if I'll be making another video about reading, but if I do, those are the books that I'm planning to read. So if you would like to kind of join me, then feel free to do so. And please tell me about your opinions about the books that I talked about in this video. I would definitely be interested to read your comments. Another thing before I end this video is that I have a personal website. I'm just gonna put random things that I work on there, but I also have a blog where I've made a few posts so far. I'm planning to make a post about once a month. If you're interested, please go to that site. I have a link in the description. It's just dennyminsayev.com. I've personally been enjoying working on those posts, and I just like writing. I think it is a nice and kind of therapeutic thing. There's something special about putting your thoughts into words. I think if you do that, you begin to kind of understand your thoughts better and understand yourself better. But yeah, that about does it. So thank you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.